Hello and welcome to today's Bible study. We're going to be finishing the book of Daniel this week by looking at what is probably the most familiar passage in the book of Daniel, an account that we've heard since we were children, and that is of the account of Daniel in the lion's den. Some things that we need to point out is that this is not normally told in the way that it actually happened, in that many of us, when we see a children's book on it or see a movie or something based, on this story, they often picture Daniel as being a young man at this time, or maybe a young adult even at this time. This account takes place after the Medo-Persian Empire had conquered the Babylonian Empire. A new king has been established named Darius. At least that's what Daniel refers to him. Historians still debate as to who this Darius actually was. But what this means is this takes place at a time just before the Judean exiles were given the order that they were allowed to return back to Jerusalem, which means that Daniel has been a captive in Babylon now for about 68 years. This takes place in about 538 BC. So if Daniel was even, say, 20 years old at the time that he was captured, and he may have been, a little younger than that, that means Daniel would have been 88 years old at this time. Daniel is not a young man. He is an old man. He is a very old man for this time period. So this isn't a, young, hale, hearty, strong man that they're putting into the lion's den. This is a fragile, feeble, 80-something-year-old, senior citizen that they're going to be doing this to. King Darius was appointed king over the Medo-Persian Empire, or at least over this part of it, again, depending on who he actually was. He appointed 120 governors to govern the various sections of the empire, and in his own palace he had 3 top officials, of whom Daniel was one. Apparently, Darius had heard about Daniel from the other people that had been in the palace at the time that it was conquered, and Darius had a great respect for Daniel. We're not sure exactly, how Daniel ingratiated himself to Darius, but Darius had a very big respect for Daniel, and Daniel became Darius's most trusted advisor. However, Daniel was still Jewish, and because of that, the other members of the court, the leftover Babylonians and the Medo-Persians, kind of had a jealousy against Daniel, because here was this foreigner who the king was favoring, who the king had made the top official in the land. So we see in this account that they set out a trap, a way to get Daniel taken out of the picture. And let's look in Daniel chapter 6, verses 6 through 10, and see how they have this trap set up. It says, "So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, 'May King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict for 30 days. Anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that, as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed.' So King Darius signed the document. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upper room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before." So we see the advisors going to King Darius, hailing him with the customary greeting, "May King Darius live forever," kind of the equivalent of our "Long live the king" statement. And they have Darius sign this statement that says that for the next 30 days, no one can pray to or make any request of any person except the king. Now, this is not an attempt necessarily to try to establish Darius as a god and saying you have to pray to King Darius. What this most likely is simply a statement trying to, in Darius's mind, show his authority. Darius is going to be taking the place of the priests for the next 30 days. Instead of someone going to the priests and saying, will you pray to the gods on account of this for me? Now they have to go to the king for the next 30 days and make that request. And the king is the only one who could pray to the gods. And that's probably simply, again, just to establish Darius' authority. He's the new ruler. He has to get the people to respect him. So this is, in Darius' mind, how he's going to set about doing that. And that's why he agreed to this statement. At the time, he probably did not consider that Daniel would continue to pray to God directly. He probably thought Daniel would come to him and say, will you pray to my God about this particular matter? The Babylonians, the Medes and Persians were a polytheistic society. They believed there were many gods. So they looked at Daniel's God as simply being one of the many gods that there were. Of course, we know that Daniel's God is the only God. But to them, Daniel's God was just one of many, so they probably thought Daniel would go to the king, or Darius probably thought Daniel would go to the king and have the king pray to his God, for anything Daniel needed. An interesting fact here, we notice it says that this law is irrevocable and cannot be changed. There's another reference to this in the book of Esther, chapter 8, verse 8, where another reference is made to an edict signed by the king cannot be changed. Apparently, this was a law of the Medo-Persian Empire so that the king would probably just not make frivolous laws. He had to when he made a law, that law had to stick. So the king would think about it long and hard before he made something a law. The law could be amended, but it could not be revoked. It could not be removed. Well, Daniel, of course, hears about this law being passed, and he does what he has always done. It says he goes to his room, and apparently his room has windows that face west towards the city of Jerusalem. And 3 times a day, Daniel would get in his window, look toward Jerusalem, and that's when he would pray to God. Now, Jesus says later, 500, almost 600 years later, Jesus says that we are to, pray in secret, or we are not to make a show of our prayers. I don't think Daniel was making a show of his prayers by praying at his window. It's just something he had always done, and he did it because this way he could look toward Jerusalem, the spot where God's temple used to be. And the temple to the Jewish people was where God met with people, so he would naturally pray facing Jerusalem and remembering the temple that used to be there, in the same way that Muslims today face toward Mecca when they pray. So he's not making a show out of his prayers. He's just praying the way he always did. He is behaving the way he has always behaved. As Christians, what we can take out of this is that no matter what society tries to do to de-emphasize our religious beliefs, we need to remember that we still need to be faithful. We still need to follow our practices. If praying is not a habit for you, it should be. Praying is something we should do often. And even if we are not necessarily allowed to pray in certain, at least not out loud during certain circumstances, we need to still remember that we need to pray faithfully to God. We can pray silently. We can pray in our hearts. Daniel just chose to pray the way he always did. He wasn't defying the law. He wasn't showing off his praying. He was just simply praying the way he had always prayed. But of course, he knew that that was breaking the law, and we now see what happens here. Look at verses 13 through 16. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day." As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. Then these men went to the king and said to him, "You as king know it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." So as soon as the advisors hear that this law is passed, or as soon as they see King Darius sign this law, they think they've got Daniel. They immediately report to the king that Daniel is continuing to pray to his God directly. He is not coming to the king for his prayers. He is going directly to his God. One of the great things about Christianity is that we can pray directly to God. We don't have to go through a priest. We don't have to have somebody pray for us. We can pray to God directly ourselves. Because of the sacrifice that Jesus made, our sins have been forgiven, and we're able to pray directly to God. So they snitch on Daniel, if you want to put it that way, and the king is very upset. Not upset with Daniel, but upset with these advisors, because the king now realizes he has been tricked. He sees through their plan. He realizes this plan is simply an excuse to get Daniel arrested and executed. But they remind him that he can't change the law. The king tried, it says there, until sundown to come up with a way that he could save Daniel. He tried to see if there was any loophole in the written law that said, Daniel could go free, but apparently there wasn't. And the advisors are quick to remind him of that. There is no changing the law. And they say, you as king, you know that, and you knew that when you signed this law. So finally at sundown, the king relents, and showing that the king himself is not above the law, he gives the arrest order for Daniel and says they arrest Daniel and throw him into the lion's den. And all the king can say to Daniel is, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Whether Daniel had told Darius about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being rescued from the fiery furnace because they refused to pray to Nebuchadnezzar's statue, we don't know or not, but Daniel may have told that to Darius, and that may have what brought this to Darius's mind. He may have heard of some of the things that Daniel's God can do and even has done. So that's why he tells Daniel, "May your God rescue you," probably thinking along the lines the same way he rescued your friends all those years ago. They throw Daniel into the lion's den. They seal the den, which would mean placing a glob of wax onto it, where the lid would cover the opening, or where the door would shut, depending how the den was actually designed. They would seal it so that anyone trying to let Daniel out would have to break that piece of wax. And it would be obvious then that someone had broken Daniel out. The king went to his bed that night, but it said that he could not sleep, and he refused to have any entertainment brought to him. He was so worried for his friend. But we, of course, all know how the story comes out. Again, this is a very familiar passage. So let's look at the rest of the story here, verses 19 through 22. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. "Daniel, servant of the living God," the king said, "has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke with the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They haven't hurt me, for I was found innocent before him. Also, I have not committed a crime against you, my king." So the next morning, after a very uncomfortable night, The king immediately gets up, goes to the lion's den. If the lions had not killed Daniel by this time, then the king was assured that Daniel's God had rescued him, and that would be an excuse to let Daniel go. So he goes to the den and calls to Daniel, very likely not expecting to hear an answer. But he calls to Daniel and says, "Has your God rescued you?" Apparently he couldn't see Daniel the way this den was designed, but he could hear him. And it says Daniel answered back, again, "May the king live forever," the customary greeting to the king. And Daniel tells the king what happened. God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. So just as God saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, God sends an angel to rescue Daniel in this case, or at least to keep him unharmed. The king then orders the den to be opened. He orders Daniel to be brought up, and he orders the advisors who had forced him into signing the law to be thrown into the den themselves. If they were innocent, then certainly the lions would not eat them as well. But the lions, of course, did end up eating them and their families. It says not only them, but their families were thrown in as well. So what do we get out of this passage of Daniel in the lion's den? What we needed to take out of it is that we need to continue to be faithful to God, even in light of persecution. Now, most of us here in America don't really know what it's like to be persecuted for our religion, at least, not if we're Christians. There are places in the world today, we've been seeing on the news recently, that there have been places in the world where people are being put to death simply because they are Christian. And that's not the attitude that we need to have, certainly. We don't need to persecute anyone simply on account of their religion. But we need to continue to follow our God and to do what our God says, whether or not other people like it, whether or not other people make fun of us, or even whether or not other people threaten to bodily harm us. Now, we do not need to deliberately go out of our way to anger someone. As Christians, we are to serve God, but we're not to do so in such a way that we're trying to make a show of it or to deliberately make somebody angry. We need to remember that at least here in America, we do have freedom of religion. Each person is allowed to practice his own religion, but we also are not to stop other people from practicing theirs. So sometimes the attitude that the rest of the country, at least the unbelievers, take is that, we as Christians, number one, that we're arrogant because we claim that Christianity is the only way to God. Well, of course, that's the truth. That's what Jesus himself said. But we don't need to be forcing that on people when they don't want to hear it. We do need to tell them the gospel, but we don't need to be accused of shoving the gospel down people's throats. Now, granted, there are some people who would even look at this video that I am posting as I'm shoving God down their throat. Well, I can just say to you, if you're watching this and you are not a believer and you are offended by what I'm saying, then stop watching. I am addressing Christian people. If you are an unbeliever and you're actually interested in what I'm saying, I will mention a little later how you can become a Christian. But as Christians, we need to be meek, as Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." We need to be humble, but we do need to be faithful to God and not give up our habit of praying, not give up our habit of going to church and worshiping with other people, and not even let people give up our habit of talking about our religion in circumstances where it is legal to do so. I spent many years of my life as a public school teacher, and there were times in class when kids would ask me what my religious beliefs were. And I would tell them, and someone might say, well, wait a minute, that's against the law. Well, no, it's not. As a teacher, as a public school teacher, I was not allowed to begin a conversation about religion. I could not openly try to recruit new Christians out of my class. But if they asked me questions, I was allowed to answer them. We have more freedoms than a lot of Christians think that we have, and especially more than a lot of unbelievers, the new atheists, think that we have. For those not familiar, the term new atheist is a term that is applied by apologists to that type of atheist who is not just content to not believe in God himself. He believes that no one should believe in God, and he believes in actually proselytizing people into becoming atheists. These are the ones who go around mocking religious people. They're the ones who go around complaining about religious people and the things they do. If you don't want to believe in God, that's your decision, and that's between you and God. But if you don't want me shoving my religion down your throat, then you don't shove yours down my throat either. If you want to debate it, feel free to ask questions. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to leave comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. If you're watching on my website, feel free to leave comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. Especially if you want to know how to become a Christian, if you are on my website, www.brianvermeer.com, then you can read the article on the right of the page that says the most important article you'll ever read. And that will tell you how you can become a true Christian, not just a Christian in name only, not just someone who believes in Jesus. Contrary to popular belief, you don't become a Christian just by believing in Jesus. You become a Christian by having a relationship with Jesus. And as always, if you would like to be informed about when new videos are posted, if you're watching on YouTube, simply click the subscribe button. If you're watching on my website, type in your email at the bar at the very top of the page, and you'll begin receiving email notices when new articles are posted. Thanks for watching, and we'll start something new next week.